I'd like to put this discussion and this now here at the 11th hour, literally. We've been at this in different combinations of people for 11 days. Tomorrow is the last day of the second course. But I'd like to put these courses and this very valuable and rich discussion in a wider context of the work of the Academy. Up until, I would say, December of 2010, the basic approach, the Academy from its inception was established to address global social issues. That's why our founding fathers created this Academy. The world they didn't need another academy. They certainly didn't need to honor themselves by calling themselves Fellows of the World Academy. They were already super honored. But they were concerned that the present institutions, even the institutions of science, including all the sciences and arts, were not sufficient to bring together a transdisciplinary view, to apply knowledge and see the implications and consequences of knowledge on global society. Up until about 4 years ago, the Academy's approach had been, like everywhere else in the world, we looked at problems sectorally. We had a long-standing program on ecology, which dates back to the late 60s. Population was a concern. We had programs on information technology going back to the early 70s in the Academy. We've been focusing on the employment issue back from 1999, I can't remember before that. And various sectors, we've had issues concerning with governance, and of course the nuclear issue, global security issue, was one of the main concerns of our founding fathers because so many of them were involved in creating the problem in one way or another in the first place. But it became clear to us, especially after the global financial crisis, maybe more concretely clear, that one of the problems was that not only practically and institutionally, but also conceptually, we had a problem that we were looking at these things as if they were independent problems that could be addressed independently. Whereas the closer we looked at them, the more clear it became of how close the linkages were. I think this is too evident to need illustration, but one which struck me very much was the problem of employment. Because more and more the problem of rising levels of unemployment has become directly connected with the problem of social unrest, fundamentalism, terrorism. In India, back in 2005, India introduced, and still runs, the largest public employment program in the history of the world. And one of the unspoken truths behind that program was that it was done primarily as a security issue, that the government understood that rising levels of disparity, not even rising levels of unemployment, but that because some parts of the society were growing so rapidly and others were not, they saw an increasing violence, increasing fundamentalism in the areas who were now informed about what was going on everywhere because of the supercommunication technology, but hadn't yet been brought in. It's very interesting, not because they were getting poorer, but because everybody else was getting richer and the disparities were growing. So this is just an example of one linkage where they introduced a massive employment program because they recognized it was essential for national security. In fact, a greater concern for national security than perceived threats from across the borders. So about 4 years ago, we started thinking and talking. We did a strategic planning exercise in which Ivo and I and Winston were very active back in 2009-10. Is there another way we can conceptualize the work of the Academy, and is there a way we can take these complex issues and approach them in a different manner? That led to our initiative on what we called New Economic Theory, which was really an attempt to look at economic theory in a wider social context, seeing the implications of it to the rest of the society and see the implications of other fields of knowledge to economy. That quickly grew, and we realized that something wider is needed, which we came to call the new paradigm. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to see it, I've circulated a concept note for our next conference on the new paradigm in Almaty in early November. This will be, I think, the 7th conference. The first one we had was in Trieste last year, and the second one was at the UN in Geneva last year. Ian and, of course, Winston were present. We had about 200 diplomats at that meeting. And after that, we've had a succession of them. And now what we've done is we've brought in other organizations. We've been working very closely with the Club of Rome now for the last almost 3 years on issues related to new economy. And now Club of Rome is working with us on this new paradigm project. And we're bringing in other organizations from other perspectives and other disciplines to help contribute to see that we get a more and more comprehensive and inclusive perspective, not only on economic issues or ecological issues, but security issues and governance issues. As we've done this, and we're continuing to do it, and we have another conference coming up in April in Baku, which we hope will be a further culmination in this process, we also recognize at the same time that there are limitations to what you can do in a conference, that you get very bright people, you put a lot of important issues on the table, and you end up not having enough time to deal with any of them. And so we decided to try taking this to the next level of trying to develop some course experiences. This is really, this program and last week is more of an attempt to create a course than to teach a course. We're bringing together a very interesting group of people from a very wide spectrum of disciplines, and unfortunately not all of them can stay with us for the 12 days, so you're seeing the last, you're part of the last of the group. But fortunately we've captured it all on video. The whole thing will be up on the web next week. And we've also had a number of people from the U.S., from as far as India and Philippines, from Europe as well, who have participated remotely, mostly passively, but a few of them have actually been interacting with us verbally or through written questions. We're trying to experiment with how we can take this process and develop things more richly. Last year, we founded the World University Consortium, and one of the reasons for doing that, and of course IUC is one of our charter members, we're very proud to have you as one of the charter members, because we recognize that we need to have much stronger linkages with the whole academic community, the whole university community, we are trying to be a bridge between all the stakeholders, not the universities at one end, but some of the organizations like Club of Rome or Green Cross or Club de Madrid or others who have knowledge, UN, who have knowledge in the field. We're trying to see how that might affect the future of the curriculum and actually experiment with it. So this effort is really the first step in a process for us in which we're learning, and so far I can only say we've learned a lot, and it's proven to be very rich experience. I'd just like to, we're going to have a discussion now, and this again is a new step that we're going to take. We're taking economic theory as an example of something that we want to do with all different fields related to society, but this is the first one because we've done the most work on it, and we're going to have a discussion. But before doing that, I'd just like to give you the background on where we have come from in the last 11 days. We started out with the premise, a very broad premise, that all of the social sciences are concerned with how human beings accomplish goals. Consciously seek to accomplish goals. Those not just goals related to wealth, well, related to governance, related to the use of power, generation and use of power, peace, prosperity, knowledge, science, psychological goals, spiritual goals, whatever it is we're seeking to do. And we're asking ourselves, the question is there anything common between the processes that we as human beings use to pursue many different goals that could help us in moving towards, how far towards remains to be seen, towards a unifying foundation for the social sciences? This is the second course. The first course, we've been looking at the problem or the challenge from two perspectives. The first one, we were looking at it from the perspective of the individual. How do individuals accomplish their goals? And equally important, what is the role of the individual in the accomplishment of social goals? And it was a very exciting activity, because when you look at some of the outstanding achievements of humanity over time, and you see how many of them can be traced back to the initiatives or the personal capacities or the personal commitment of a single individual. I was quoting Margaret Mead, who said, I'm paraphrasing, all great accomplishments can be traced back to a small group. And that's the way we start with somewhere. Whether it's an individual or a small group, we're the catalyst. Individuals are the catalyst for change. So we wanted to understand the role of the individual, which is often not discussed in the social sciences, where we're looking at the macro behavior, we're looking at the statistics and the norms. And if we can do that in physics, where every subatomic particle is the same, even if it's unpredictable, but we see the disproportionate role of some individuals in society, and we thought we need to understand that. We can't have a real science of society without understanding this phenomenon. And now this week, we're trying to look at it from the perspective of the collective. Our rationale, which is really the basis for what we've been discussing, is that the challenge, we're not doing this just as an intellectual challenge because we think it's interesting, but we've come to the conclusion that the challenges we face at humanity today require new thought, new theoretical foundations, as well as new institutions, new policies, and new laws, and many other things. But that it's not enough we try to change things on the surface. We really have to improve our understanding of how all of this comes together. We know that knowledge is powerful. We've seen the benefits of that knowledge in scientific disciplines, and in every discipline we've benefited from it. If we're lacking some of the power we need to deal with our problems, our premise is that there's a greater knowledge we need. So let's look beyond what we have done up until now. We're not trying to throw anything out or reject the value of any of the scientific achievements in any of the fields. We're trying to see, is there some boundaries we need to transcend? And maybe this is one way to do that. I think as Ivo and Ian both mentioned, we're in a moving context now, a very rapidly moving context, which is maybe another justification for this. In terms of speed, things are changing greater than ever before. In terms of space, we've gone from the local and the national to the global level. We're hardly able to keep up with the pace of the changes in acquisition of knowledge, at least in some fields. The whole global social organization is unfolding before our very eyes, most visibly in the internet, but it's happening at all levels. More than we can understand, more than we can even track and measure as it goes along. Different fields and different activities are getting more and more integrated with each other. It used to be things could be somewhat separate, but now every field is dependent on, related to virtually every other field. Industrialization was pretty much divorced from science and education up until about 1850. In fact, in fact, technology development was pretty well divorced from science until really 1900. It was the thinkers and inventors who were doing the invention, and the scientists were doing something else. Nowadays, everything is linked to everything else. This is a theme. I only mention it. It was a long discussion last week. But we seem to be discovering, society seems to be discovering ways to bring out more of the potentialities of human beings than in the past. More of the potentialities of more people. We have new technologies for that, like education. And things are all of this means a greater complexity than ever before. These factors suggest that our knowledge needs to catch up with the complexity of the global situation, and that's our fundamental rationale. If we want to look at the issue in its totality, we've concluded we have to look at it from multiple perspectives. We have to look at it from the level of society and how society operates. We have to certainly do, as Ian has been saying, we have to take into account the impacts of society on the environment and vice versa, and include that in our conceptual framework in ways that we have not done very well up until now. We have to understand the role of organizations, national, international, local, of all types, formal and informal, in that process. And we have to also understand the role of individuals in that process, maybe better than we have understood them up until now. And we have to understand how all of this comes together in particular events in space and time. So this we're trying to map out, and we did it in many other ways too, but we're trying to map out the totality of the field in which we're exploring for new ideas. We have had a lot of discussions on why we should be doing this, why there's a need for an evolution of science. We've concluded that the fragmentation of the disciplines, which was very valuable strategy up to a certain point, is increasingly a limitation on our further progress. The application of concepts of society as mechanical concepts of society, mechanized concepts of society, which may lend themselves to mathematics very well, but ignore the human dimension, ignore the role of values, ignore the role of attitudes, ignore the role of trust or distrust. Psychological and subjective factors need to be taken into account. I've mentioned the individual part of this. And so it led us, this is a basic rationale for coming here. We thought and discussed a lot and debated a lot about transdisciplinarity and what fundamentally that would mean for us, that it at once addresses issues between disciplines, across disciplines, and perhaps beyond individual disciplines. And one of our purposes in the last 2 weeks is to say, what lies beyond individual disciplines? Is there some commonality beyond that? Our specific objectives were to look beyond the boundaries, and that's one of the things we're going to try to do this afternoon and see how it works. We've been doing it in an ad hoc way through the earlier discussions. Looking beyond what are the fixed boundaries or perceived boundaries of disciplines to become more and more conscious of the linkages and interdependencies between them. All the disciplines are aware of many of these things. Many of them we consider externalities, but we'd like to see what happens if we try to map in any field, in this case, the field of economics, how much it depends on its interactions with all other fields. Boone mentioned an important point, and I hope we have time to come back and discuss it later, as to who's going to set the values for this and who's going to decide what's desirable about this. I think that's a fair question. Our concern is that that's happening all the time. Whether or not we may pretend that we're only scientists detached from reality and discovering the way things work, but in fact every social system we have has implicit values in it that are determining the outcomes. Our present policies, the present way our economic system works, decides how the benefits are distributed, and Ian gave a number, it decides what those outcomes are. So our goal is not to say that we're going to sit up here on Olympus and decide what the values are and decide how the system should work. What we'd like to do is make the implicit values explicit and show that where the values, you can only consciously control something, you can only control something when you're conscious of it. Too many people today believe that unemployment levels are inevitable, that that's just the way economic market systems work, and we have no choice. That's not true. Too many people believe that this economic consumption of the planet is inevitable, and it's after all, it's either that or prosperity, or it's getting more, or we have to destroy the planet. And that's not true. I don't think it's true. So we want to make explicit the assumptions. And if Alberto Zucconi were here, he's a psychologist running a big institution in Italy, he would argue that in all of our sciences, our social sciences, we're filled with implicit value judgments and decisions, and part of our task is to make them explicit. So society knows the choices that are being made and can decide whether it's capital investments in plant and machinery that should be encouraged by depreciation allowance, and we should be taxing payroll, or we should be doing, as Ian said, maybe something very different than that, because that's also a market economy, but it's a market economy that's reinforcing different behaviors. So we want to look behind. We want to also search, and a fascinating experience for me in the last 12 days, 11 days, to see how much commonality we could find among the social sciences. And from different fields, whether it was from law or economics or political science or psychology, we were using the same terms to talk about problems, rather than each having our own language. And we're going to try to explore is there something we can build out of this? Is there something more fundamental we can learn about? It's the same society, whether we're governing ourselves or producing wealth or fighting wars. There's only one society. We're the same human being, whether we're raising families or being in a profession or being in politics or fighting on the battlefront. There are different aspects of human behavior. Isn't there some commonality, fundamentals that we can understand? So that's a broad rationale for what brought us here. And now, in very, very brief summary, I have listed, it's not an exhaustive list, and some of you may like to modify this list, but I think those who are not here would feel at least that the items they flagged in the discussions are on the agenda. The first one belongs to a different category. We've all been talking about the importance of values in determining how social outcomes are placed. My purpose in showing this list is that we'd like to have a discussion this afternoon specifically about economics. Whatever thoughts you may have, with regard to as many of these factors as we've identified, to see what relevance, looking at economic theory from the perspective of these variables, may help us see the way towards a greater integration and towards a more effective science. We propose to do the same thing with the other disciplines as well, but this is kind of our first case. So values has been a constant throughout our 2 weeks. Knowledge. the social construction of our knowledge. As Alberto said a few days ago, science doesn't discover reality. Science creates a construction of reality, an interpretation or a perspective on reality.
Which works.
Huh?
Which works. Yeah.
Right. Which works sometimes, and which sometimes doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, it's also. And so the question is, to what extent, that's what I think Ian meant when he talked about Newtonian laws in economics, to what extent are the laws of economics really Newtonian laws? Are they fixed? Are the determinations set? To what extent could they be different? How much is this a social construction of economics trying to imitate physics, and how much is it a real nature of the way economic systems work? This morning, Ivo spoke about rationality, about the limits to rationality. Limits in terms of how rationally we're behaving, and limits to what might be the inherent limits in the way we're using the mental faculty. That's another big topic. So, social power, which I know you were talking about, this is a term that was coming up everywhere. If we think about social power, it has many connotations to it, because we think of social power as who's really the power behind the throne that's determining how things happen. But in a more general way, all the capacities of society to accomplish are expressions of social power. If I can fly from here to New York, or we can speak on the phone or communicate with people on the other side of the world, it's a power. It's a power for accomplishment that's been created by society. It may be a technological power or a social organization called the Internet or something else. So we've been looking and talking about where this power comes from. Winston was talking about it. How does the social power become political power? And how does the society generate political power? How does it become legal power? By what process? These are, so it's an important fundamental concept. So what I'd like to do, if you agree and if you think there's something fundamental missing from the list, we can add it. What I'd like to do is start one by one. We'll see how far we get. But starting with the first one, linkages between fields. Could we just enumerate and identify all of the factors that determine how non-economic factors that influence and determine how economy works?
Perception, psychology, or it's really important because the concept of value depends on our personal preferences and the ability to judge all the values, to make a list of priorities while thinking of values. So the real value not outside of the human beings, inside their mind, what they are judging as a real value. So psychology, I think, is very important. Linkage between economy and actually it's a link between psychology and economics.
A few days ago, I gave the example of FDR and what he did during the Great Depression to stop the banking crisis after 6,000 banks had failed. And essentially, the President of the United States got on the radio and talked like a psychotherapist to the people and said, your real problem is not in the economy or in the banks, your real problem is you're afraid. And your fear is causing a panic, and the panic is destroying the banking system, so go and put your money back. He really understood an economic issue in purely not purely, but to a large extent in psychological terms. And the remedy was a psychological remedy, not the economic parts of it, the institutional parts of it, the legal parts of it came later.
I wrote an article about the crisis, and I thought was crisis is among us. So which means that we don't trust anyone who is going to first to take the debt. It depends on the rush and so on and so on. So I think that kind of linkage can be.
I think Ian used the word trust.
Trust
earlier. And so then it raises the question, how do we create trust in the society? How can we create more trust? And if we could create more trust today, what would be the impact on our economic system?
You know, there is a very interesting shift from customer to member. Because of the IT technology, you can join a group on internet, you can discuss, you can send comment to the company whose good services and goods you're buying, and then it's really changing the role of the customer. I think that the notion of customer belongs to the old paradigm because of the changing and the shifting in IT technology and internet and everything.
Yes.
I have one idea. I think that somehow we mentioned earlier, or actually we mentioned in private discussion, the real needs of people. What are the real needs, material needs, and needs? That's the basis for the economy, why it should work. And I think a lot, and we mentioned it earlier, something that what are the real needs in different parts of the world didn't we reach at in the Western world a certain level. It's not anymore the need, but rather the system that drives us to have the need, although we don't know. And I think that the whole understanding of this model of economy is based on the assumption that there is still a huge material need. Yes, there is, but in the parts where there is, it's still creating more injustice, I think, than actually providing to satisfy these needs. So there is something really crooked about the model, but I think the question about the real needs is really
one of the major problems that we are facing is the huge gap between the real and financial economies.
Yeah.
How to bridge it. We lost control.
Yeah.
We have trillions of dollars circulating. We lost the control of money generation. And there are ideology and politics influencing the country. From United States, China, Russia, India, Brazil, we see that type of improvements to really efficiently allocate resources to meet the needs. And then when we're talking about needs, we need to differentiate needs and wants. These are the different things. Yeah, we have too much emphasis on wants, but we not necessarily have the rational. Thank you.
Thank you.
One thing I didn't see in the list, and perhaps seems to me the one thing that economics has that can be good and bad is the notion of a common denominator, a metric.
Yeah.
Metric to measure. And the metric that we use in economics is essentially real dollars. And that, of course, is part of. It's a good thing that you've got a metric that you can put everything on a level playing field. So a unit of labour, a unit of natural capital, a unit of capital, and you can, in theory, make a price service and then compare them. And then you can look at the judicious mix that gets you the most bang for your dollar. The problem is that it forces us into I think, a moral hazard. And so the one question is, are there new metrics that should be applied? Are we talking units of happiness, units of human contentment, units of, and I don't know what it is, but it seems to me if we don't search for the unit, we will have a very hard time getting to the transdisciplinary nature of the beast we're dealing with. So I suggest one part of this linkage is the linkage in thinking through, are there a set of metrics? We know in Bhutan, this is a rather silly, trivial example, this gross domestic happiness notion, but nevertheless it's got something there about, is there a metric that we should be discovering now that is transdisciplinary in nature?
Can I follow? There is something called life quality research,
which takes place in my discipline and also in borderline between economics and psychology.
What did you call it?
Social science, life quality.
Life quality.
Yeah, which is an attempt to find some metric. When you ask people, it's based on questionnaires, which means that it's limited in terms of how well you can measure it, because there are always problems related to survey research. But that's an attempt at least to come up with another metric. Yeah. Could I also add, I mean, I was looking, when you talk about economics, was resources in this list?
I was trying to list social phenomena that impact, on economics rather than the concepts that are central to economics themselves.
Okay,
but we can list it, of course. Huh?
Yeah.
No, you mentioned social.
Social resources. Well, yeah, social. We put social capital and human capital on the list.
Yeah, because what you talked about when you mentioned social power, I guess this is a daring enterprise, because we would probably have different definition of some of these concepts. So we could agree on some of the concepts on the list, but we could mean different things.
For sure, we will. We will.
Well, there is nothing bad in that. I think, it's sorting of certain things. We can always resort them in a different way.
In fact, I'm glad you mentioned the social resources, because one of the most fascinating parts of the discussion in the last 2 weeks has been regarding the fact that human productivity, human fulfillment of human needs, whether they're economic or otherwise, the real foundation for that, we traditionally think the basis of economic fulfillment is production or growing something. But today, 70% or more of our economy is really the service economy, which is based on human relationships. And when you get outside of the economic sphere, when you get into the political sphere of what gives us a sense of social stability or participation or psychological fulfillment, it's 99% or 95% human relationships. So what is how do we understand the underlying role of human relationships now in the context of economy? Now, Zvig was talking 2 days ago about networking, and networking is what in our efforts is a more organized or formal or comprehensive form of social organization. We have many types of social organization, some of them very loose and some informal, some of them becoming more and more complex, more sophisticated, more dense today. And then you were talking this morning about clusters as a specific application of that. So to what extent do we think about the role of social organization in economics, if it's there is industrial clusters today? What happens if we look at the entire field of economics as a field of networking? Which, of course,
consumers organization.
I mean, the market is really a networking device. The money is really a networking tool to facilitate exchange. We see the whole society is developing its capacities for social organization and networking. How does that impact on our theory in economy? It's an example of the social resource. It's very fascinating. Yes?
As a suggestion, another question still. Let's say taking a look into these items, one is presented with the professor of limits of rationality. But let's say my problem is a physicist.
You were in our discussion in Hyderabad.
My problem is just to understand, let's say, the money as such. Because money is invention, human invention. So from that point of view, if you compare, for example, in mathematics, numbers are human invention. Numbers that doesn't exist in nature, like oil or whatever. But in some theories, mathematical theories, we have inherent contradictions. The problem to understand some, let's say, part of mathematics, which are connected to the Gödel theorem, and we have contradiction despite the fact that the claim they are consistent, they are not. So understanding of some, let's say, mathematical structure we have a problem. We have a problem with our rationality. You know, what is the, let's say, consistent or inconsistent theory? On very simple level. So from my point of view is the problem in mind. Do we understand this invention completely with all this financial transaction today? Do we understand this invention?
Good question. Very good question. No, obviously not, because we have a huge amount of money in a virtual sphere, you know. So this is obviously there is a serious problem. Very serious.
The economy currency, and we have the non-real economy currency.
Yeah.
And that's the one we don't understand.
And then we have something that we discussed. And that's about 80% or more.
Yeah. And then we have something that we discussed recently, and this was the question of complementary currency, which there was a report to the Club of Rome by our friend Liakar. And of course, all of you use complementary currency, for instance, in the case of frequent flyers. And of course, when you go and buy at your favorite shop, you know, you have extra points or whatever. So this
Losing money.
Yeah. How about, Winston, how about from the point of view of law? You know, we went last year to CERN, and we were the former director, our trustee, was giving us a tour of and telling us about the construction of the big accelerator, and he explained part of it was under Switzerland and part of it was under France, and
50 kilometers around.
Yeah. And I forget exactly what he said, Ivo can correct me, but one of the things that struck me was that you could do this in France because below 5 meters from the surface of the earth, the land didn't belong to the person who owned the plot. Whereas in the U.S., I think we go all the way to the center of the earth. We may not be able to get there. And of course, if we go all the way to the center of the earth, I don't know why we don't go all the way up to the moon also, in which case these satellites are trespassing on our private property, at least in America. So the very concept of who owns a resource is based on a legal premise. So how many legal premises are there which are determining the way our market economy functions, which are not related to the market economy?
Unquestioned artifacts, and then you would have like it said, oh, personality, well, sure, that then sure, why don't we just create all kinds of other personalities? Let's create corporations, let's create multinational corporations, let's incorporate cosmocorps. So you can take many instances with some analogy to sense experience and then create, So we take something like the nation state and we want to endow personality. So we endow its geography with a certain personality, like you mentioned, in Switzerland and France and so on. And then at some points in time you begin to see, well, this is an artificial thing. You can't make corporations responsible all the way to cut across the border or whatever. So we have cut across them now, or Burger King has become Canada Burger King to avoid US taxes. And of course, one of the difficult problems that we have here is the extent and degree to which lawyers then can, in the pay of vested interests, can manipulate the system for the few. And I've been involved in some of these things because I've defended some of the nations in the Amazon. And I've had to come up with multinational corporations. Angry multinational corporations, because I happen to define the way in which those corporations may or may not enter into Indian territory to get their oil industry. They're angry about this. So yes, there's a huge amount of challenge both to the ethics of the profession and so on, but fundamentally to that, I think in the US we're still influenced by the the statement of Holmes that, should everyone understand law, looking from the bad man's point of view. The bad man wants to know not what's good or whether it's a good idea to honor a contract. He wants to know what's the cost of breach. I don't want to honor this contract, but if I can get away with it by paying a little bit less and doing something else, that's what I'm going to do. It's not morally. And so that's a big challenge in law, and you made it for some years ago. A huge number of the highest ranking lawyers in the United States were sent to jail because of the Watergate cover-up, including the Attorney General of the United States. So that's a continuing challenge, and hence the discourse, at least in legal theory, has been so vigorous about the defense of boundaries and that wing of the profession that says we're not bound by anything except the guy that pays us the most.
Yeah. What I don't know if transdisciplinary, as far as I know, is what is the unit of account? What is the boundary conditions you set on the economy? To give you a practical example, Sweden just did an analysis of its carbon footprint and waved flags left, right, and centre about how its carbon footprint is in decline. It declined because it closed all its factories, but all in China and re-importing. So the unit of account and the boundary questions are a damn sight more complex today than they've ever been. And I think that is it's this global versus local issue. But it's not just as simple as I think we once thought. It's not just a trade issue. It's a much deeper and more profound issue. The boundary questions you raised. In fracking, it's quite interesting to see American companies in Britain, because as you said, in America, the individual farmer would own all the land and can damage the water system there and allow it to go to downstream. In England, you don't own the. So I think the boundary questions are ones that have to be dealt with in a fundamental.
At least make them explicit. Because that's how, our copyright and our patent laws work that way. I don't know if anybody knows the history better than I do, but the copyright laws have been pushing the boundaries of it used to be 50 years after the author's death, and now they've got corporations like Disney who are getting up to 120 years, or perpetual. And that affects the way economy works. That affects the pricing of our medicines and of so many things and the access to information. Even if it is a copyrighted or patented material is based on hundreds of years of cumulative knowledge that's been taken free by somebody, they add something to it, and for 100 years after that, they claim everything. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying here's an area where the way our economic system works is based on factors that are beyond economy.
Yeah, just to add one thing, the strategic position of major economic forces in the US is to fight tooth and nail to be free to move their assets abroad. And at the same time, they want to make sure that there's not going to be any regulation, either ethical or treaty or whatever. So what they look for is a legal vacuum. You want to move to any place where it's a non-regulatory context, and then you can pollute, you can do anything you like, but you're not accountable for it because outside of the effective legal and political jurisdiction of a concerned body policy.
Which really,
the consequences are still there to get.
Which really illustrates the obvious that there's no economy without political economy, that the economy doesn't exist in itself.
Labor laws are the same thing.
No, labor laws.
As my knowledge, the UN has not a great document, but it has a code of conduct for multinational corporations. And they have to write it, but I don't think a single multinational corporation has ever signed up to the code of conduct, ethical conduct. And most recently, the Supreme Court analysis was fine for multinational corporations for torturing people. We're not going to be accountable.
I have a question maybe for Ian, but it's something I think we've talked about earlier. the traditional economic concept of efficiency is defined quite in narrow terms. How much of resources do you put in to produce something, and what do you get as a result? But we have taught many times, and others too, maybe it goes back to your comment, Boone, about public good, is what happens when the economic activity measured in strictly conventional economic terms is highly efficient, but the costs to society of that are much greater. But economically it's efficient.
No, financially it's efficient, but not economically. But that is a big factor that I've noticed in a lot of the economic discourse over the last few years. People misreading financial rates of return, economic rates of return. And we've made it seem to be the same thing. Now, a good financial rate of return may well be a negative economic rate of return.
I mean, one of the classic examples is in employment. We had a conference on global employment challenge a few years ago, and Randall Ray from the U.S. was one of our speakers. And they have quantified that the cost of unemployment in the U.S. is greater than the cost of paying a salary to a person to get them to work, in terms of deteriorating health care, higher crime rates, imprisonment, and other costs to the society. But so, in looking at economics,
in order to pay for those services, you tax labor even more.
Right. So you get more.
You have a vicious circle. If you tax the employer, social costs are not high, are not taking so long. You will get a very different outcome, which is, I think, this business of getting a level playing field level in economic terms and resource terms to the real value you attach to labor, the real value you attach to natural resources. That's where it's so out of alignment that it's inevitably going to drive us towards depleting natural resources. And we do it, by the way, secretly, because we think we're actually depleting built capital. If you analyze built capital, 90% of it is natural resources: water, energy, sand, cement, whatever you might, and glue to put it together, as it were. So I think that is the understanding between financial or market prices and real resource costs is absolutely right. Absolutely central.
Bora, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, one thing, two things. One thing that actually kind of goes to the same line with Winston and Garry were saying, and I just put it maybe in a different way. The drive for profit endangers other than economic, other than financial, social spheres, so such as health, security, peace, and stability. So I think what we need, what is needed is to set a criteria once this either economic or financial sphere actually crosses this boundary and enters to endanger other social spheres. And on a more theoretical level, I think what we have is economic liberalism, but we don't actually have political freedoms and civic freedoms in the full sense of the global scale.
Another area is education. I mean, the data are pretty clear across the globe. There are always a few exceptions, but across the globe, higher levels of education means higher rates of employment and higher incomes as well. Now, how would an economic system address education if we really wanted to maximize the development of human capital for social welfare and for individual welfare, and how would that system work differently, theoretically or practically, than it's working now? Yes?
Today it was said two times public good and public good, let's say generally. Let's say if you take a look in education, from my point of view, sometimes in English it is said public service. like transportation, like I don't know what. But I think that education is much more important. Because this is something, I would say, of sine qua non of this civilization, at least as we know. From that point of view, I think that it's very important that it still should be public. This is not something on the market or whatever. Without that, I think we are somehow lost the civilization. This is not service. Public service is much more important from that point of view. So, in any terms, which is, let's say, which is, you can use from that to use some, let's say, new technology and so on, but still, this last public good, which means responsibility, which means, I don't know, some kind of control public and so on. Obviously, this is the cost. This is something we should pay, like society or individual. But generally, it should be public cost on all levels of education.
And the irony, just one point on that, the irony is that on education, in almost every country, it's mandatory up to a certain level. It's not just that we provide it free. You have to have it. Now, what would be the impact on global economy if the mandatory level of education were raised by 2 more years or 3 more years? What would it do to human welfare? What would it do to the society? So this is not an economic issue today. I mean, this is a policy issue.
I mean, one of the problems with human capitalist theory, or one of the problems, was that we related education to wage rates and what you would earn. And there are 2 dangers of that. First is, I think, a lot of disillusionment in Spain and other places when you've got 52% young graduates unemployed. So we've got to recognize human capital theory has to be linked with the ability to create jobs, not simply doing. The second one, well, 2 other points. One is we've got to move from a linear concept of education, which is we move 10 years or whatever through the system, stop there, and then work for 30 years. We need a new concept of continuing education that's linked with the massive changes to economic and social structure. The third thing is education is really also about the creation of a new set of global citizens with responsibility. It's not just about jobs. And I think that that's where the public good dimension of it really lies. Is education is good for education's sake, for all, and especially girls in developed countries. So I think there is, but I think it's got to go beyond just the classical narrow rates of return, which a lot of human capital theory, as you know, has spent a lot of time on. Especially in the US.
But I just add one thing to that, coming of course entirely from my personal situation, being very old. We have now actually the situation where we have more and more of people who are quite old. So the idea that we had with the Bismarckian idea of going to retire at the age of 65 was perfect when there was nobody older than 65 in the world, or very few people. Now when we have, it is pushing to roughly 20 to 25% of people older than 65. And what do you do with these people? You know, I mean, yeah, and of course, yeah. And so there is a lot of problems of this sort that, you know, we have to somehow solve. Of course, there were always old people. I mean, famous story is Verdi composed his best work when he was 70. Goethe did his best work when he was 80, and so on. But then we're unique. Now you have 55%, you know. So this is a different ball game. You have to make them useful, you know.
I was just wondering, I mean, when you say religious fields, you know, there are all kinds of sectors here, and all kinds of different levels of normativity, in terms of density and explicitness of denial of it. But now when we look at economics, there are some, at least in our kind of dominant issues that stand out. And I'm just wondering whether the idea that Roosevelt had, but didn't fulfill, a code of employment rights.
Which is in the second Bill of Rights.
The second Bill of Rights, yeah. And I'm just wondering if that's not the worthwhile thing to pursue. In many areas you have to be more selective. But what I'm trying to get at is, it would help if we could translate what seemed to us to be some of the obvious values at stake into a code of ethics, code of conduct. So, I'm not, but I'm not constrained by anything. No, here you are. This is what, this is the cost of all the protections and things we give you to become rich. We talk about the idea of responsibilities for the rest of us, maybe for the corporate and the web sector. So I'm just wondering whether we should, at the back of our minds, begin to consider whether to bring in codes of ethics for different sectors of significance in social science.
Yes.
I'm still in that I'm not quite sure what we are doing here. I'm afraid, but it's
Trying to get you out of the box.
That's all. No. We are trying to get out of the box. We're trying to get out of the box.
I could be kind of, I noticed when you mentioned different economies, you're economist or the health economy, blah, blah, and then you have microeconomy and macroeconomy there, which to me would be the different levels, right, which of course you would know much better than I do. And some of these concepts here are at best sliding between levels, and some of them are more specifically at the micro and at the macro level. Right? So, if that's the intention, or
the intention, I'm glad you have every right to be wondering, because this is, as I said at the beginning, is an experiment. What we're trying to do is, this is part of a long process.
Yeah.
We're trying to take the impressions of the last 2 weeks and reflect on one particular topic, and just see if it uncovers some things that. We've been working on new economic theory from the inside of economics for a long time. We just thought, will this discussion help us flag some other issues with regard to economy that will help us in our ongoing efforts with it? So this is not intended to be an organized, output. It's a brainstorm.
Okay, so in that case, I'm just problem.
Good.
Well, one of the things is sort of people, demography would be a link to another discipline that's also important for the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And a part of that is, we talked about women, how they behave when they get better educated, and the number of children they have, right, would be an issue. And also immigration, or emigrating. So, yeah, the fact that people are moving across the globe,
Absolutely.
which would be very relevant. Yeah.
I think one thing about the list here is that every factor on the list has the capacity to influence every other factor.
Yeah.
So they're not discrete. They're all. But what we try to find out is what exactly is the role of decision making in understanding the limits to rationality, or the role of decision-making in social process and energy conversion, and we can go through that's.
You mentioned the education of women, and that's a good example of where our capacity to have a productive society depends on our social construction of what is the role of people in the society. To us, it's a very evident example, because attitudes in the West are different than they are in some other places. We all have constructions of one type or another. The way our economic system works, one of our fellows, who's also almost a founding member of the Club of Rome, Mario Giarini, he's argued for a long time that our economic theory only deals with the monetarized economy. 200 years ago, when Adam Smith wrote, actually 230 years ago, the monetarized economy was at less than 20% of the whole economy. Most things didn't flow through the money economy. Now, today, we've got a situation where if a mother with children decides to go to work, she needs somebody to clean the house, maybe to cook, and also to take care of the kids. So she hires people to do that, so that she can go to work. And according to economic theory or measurement, wow, we're really prospering. Her quality of life is gone. The mental health of the kids and maybe even the nutrition of the kids has gone through the floor. The family is dissolving. But we're all better off because of that. But this lies outside of, economic theory doesn't talk about. Today, the bottled water industry in the world is upwards of $60 or $80 billion. According to that, we're all much better off because we're drinking bottled water. Mostly we're drinking it because we're afraid of what's polluting the water. And if that's really we should all be drinking bottled water, we'll all be having greater prosperity, then I guess what the next thing we should do is we should pollute the air so badly that we have to buy bottled air also. And then what will happen to GDP? It'll go through the roof because something that's free and outside of the economic system is inside it. So these are just, we're looking to understand the boundaries between real reality and how we've conceptualized it.
Can I add something?
Of course.
To what you said, it's obviously not an education of children, but I do see that you have it in a collective sense there in saying human capital, education skills. So to add to that, children, the education of children, if you look at the quality of education of children, they would already be looking at themselves in the future. When I am a non-economist look at it objectively, to me the biggest problem is the power of global investment, monopoly, corporation.
Yeah.
Now, is that intended to address that main problem? Because in places like Africa, they come in, as someone said earlier, and money doesn't even come to South Africa. With settles or whatever status, America would come in and promise all kinds of advantages and benefits, and in the end, Africa is indebted to America, and the money doesn't even flow there. It goes from the bank in America to a company in America. I think that's one of the biggest problems that's got to be addressed as a matter of extreme urgency, because these corporations do not care about anybody but themselves, and they constitute the 0.1% of the globe.
This is also a reason why we concluded that it's not enough we talk about economics. Winston just has written an article which is being published this week, I think, in Eruditio, where he looked at the other side of that is the influence of corporations and money on the political system. You really cannot solve the you can't look at the economy independent of the political system because of that close interaction. And that's why if we're going to have a real knowledge, let alone whether we have the power to change it, but if we're really going to have knowledge, we have to look at how the political decisions are being made, what's influencing law, what's influencing the policy decisions, and how that impacts the distribution of wealth and the utilization of resources. It's a great example of that.
You just said in one word, selfishness. You said it in the year one, you were sitting over there.
Yeah.
It's individual selfish. No self-gains.
Selfishness is life.
Well, if that's the theory that we're running, then at least we ought to call it. Then we ought to call it what it is and say selfish economics. Not neoliberal or Keynesian, but selfish economics. And let the politicians say that. According to the theory of selfish economics, this is the best thing we should do. Right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, something related to that, and maybe continuing on what I said earlier. Coming from political philosophy, and actually what comes now mainly, it was triggered by a question of values, and where we actually had to. Huge debate, a huge discussion actually with trying to see the possible new model for the world. is, let's say, put in very superficially cosmopolitan model. And now the question is, of course, politically cosmopolitan, what it means economically, what it means culturally, and so on. But I think regarding economy, we have an issue that economies are trying still to use nation boundaries, to be nation-bounded economies for the sake of profit and for the sake of internal organization of the labor and the market and everything. But at the same time, big powers, global, they use everything else beyond the boundaries. So we have a problem. There is so-called liberty beyond boundaries, but once we need to have our own interest, it's nation-bounded. And of course, this is a big cause for wars. And this is, I think, this guides us to see very clearly another value, huge value, and it's peace, peace for all, and then securing human rights for all, and to secure basic human needs for all. And I think we are coming to the moment when all these interdependencies are not so to say, equally distributed, but they are very one way or just influenced by one side. So we need actually, there was always all the time trying just to give a framework, and now I really go deeper in the problem. It's actually to have a very strong, critical, ethical perspective to how these processes actually work. They are not very just going to develop something to make the globe. Of course, we are seeing certain problems, but unfortunately, these problems are, some of them are very continuous. They cannot be tackled in one thing or one moment only. So we have here some processes, I think, which we need to see, and especially they concern the economy.
So I understood that we need the right to secure more rights, actually to claim more rights.
No. Actual.
Yeah.
I think the structure of property rights and intellectual property is a fundamental driver. It's quite interesting to talk about large companies. I'm certainly observing, and I suspect it's correct, that those that will be built to last and will make a contribution to society tend to be the ones that are not publicly listed, but the shareholders that tend to be the ones in the family owned. So the whole pressure on who owns what, and we're now seeing China, for example, gobbling up half of Africa with purchasing property. So the whole range of property rights, I suspect, is one. It could be a fundamental driver towards economic outcomes. And I know that maybe another transdisciplinary.
One theory of what you just said about China and Africa is that some of the view that China's just got a population that it cannot sustain, and so it's very amount of time sustainability or swing, and Africa's not certainly benefiting. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what was the last part of it?
Africa's not benefiting from Chinese. What shall we call it? Colonization. China has gone out there to feed their population, and I've spoken to someone from Gabon, and there's a theory for Chinese where in Zimbabwe now, in order to own mines, you have to be indigenous to 1%. So what the Chinese are doing, they're intermarrying the Zimbabweans in order to achieve that. In Gabon, for example, I was told by another friend that, they have these huge forestries, and they are so isolated and so valued and treasured, and nobody enters the territory. You have pygmies living there. And guess who's living opposite the pygmies and intermarrying the pygmies of the Chinese? Now, to what extent are they going, to achieve that goal of feeding their people? It's very complex and interwoven. And
that's the complexity we have to deal with. To illustrate it in another way, in an opposite kind of way, we we were working with Ian last year on the idea of trying to model what's happening to employment globally. Because traditionally employment has been regarded as a function of national policy. But we listed at least 50 factors that are impacting on employment in different countries that are coming from the external environment today, which really are reducing the power of national level policy to impact on what happens within the country. But there's another, and which also shows if our economic theory says this is how you handle employment because it's done at the national level, when so many of the factors are international, then we have to think about what is the theory of global employment? Is it a zero-sum game, which is kind of the way it's often depicted? So we did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, because that's all that the data was available for, not any other reason, to try to estimate, just to turn the other thing around, well, how much employment is the U.S. economy generating outside of itself? We can do it for pollution, too. I'm sure that's probably been done, to show that our contribution to carbon footprint is not really going down. We're just making those footprints in other parts of the world. But what we found was that in many of the, even though unemployment was going up to, at one point it was up to almost 9.5% or something like that, if you really looked at what had happened over the 10-year period, the total contribution to employment in the U.S. was about 110% of the jobs within the country. That is, we had created so many jobs outside as well. So if our goal, if the goal is to look at things globally and how do we manage global resources in a way that's going to be effective for all, we really need to look at many of our traditional constructs and concepts and ways of measuring. And what would be the strategy for global full employment? National full employment you might get by exchange rate variations that would depreciate your currency and just become the sole exporter, which is China has been doing for a long time. But how do you do that in such a way that it's not a zero-sum game, but it actually creates the most for everybody? I don't think we have those constructs today. Even if we don't have the answers, at least we can raise the questions and flag the issues. Yes.
The issues of moral hazard on that is really an important one. Obama's done more for jobs than any American president, probably in China, not in the US.
That wasn't a compliment when he said it.
But it does raise the issue of unemployment. In think of full employment, I think it was a national thing. But of course, there's a moral hazard there. If you know how to create full employment at the national level, you are going to get more people coming in. This is a good example of basically full employment, and it's had an influx of people. So we have to therefore have the values of being a global citizen and be able to be proud that we've created something global. In America, actually, I once had a concept we're trying to develop, which is not to talk about a country's development aid, but its development impact. For example, America, in terms of medical education, has probably done more for the world than all of its development aid by just bringing people in. Obviously, it's earned more by having trained people out, people trained outside and get their initial training, and then they come to the States and get 1 or 2 year top up, and you end up with a fully fledged, fully educated doctor. And all of that was larger, the value to American society was larger than all of the development aid that had ever come out. A study that was done a few years ago. So I think we have got to decide what our system boundaries are on this. At least make them explicit.
Yeah, at least make them.